Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening from wherever you're joining us. Many times I find myself guiding students at the graduate level, talking to industry partners, talking to different corporations around the power of compute, the power of artificial intelligence. And I always remind them that the role of computing, the role of AI, is not about numbers. The role of computing is about insight. When you think about it, at one end, it's very useful for me to go to a company and say, hey, as per the data, it looks like you're getting attacked X number of times with Y kind of threat. Useful. That's information. But how do you derive insight from that? How do you generate impact from them? It's a whole different equation when I come to the table and say, we've noticed that these are the trends, and this is how we've responded to them. And this is how we've prepared proactively to take the next measures that are required. And my guest today is going to be somebody who's going to emphasize on that proactive element of computing, of AI, and how it's applied to the world of cybersecurity. I'm talking about a firm called DarkTrace. Earlier today, you would have noticed on their website that they've just been awarded the AI Enterprise Solution Award from a very prestigious AI practice in New York. This is a firm that started off in 2013, now sits with at least across 5 major tech centers, got close to, if not over 1,000 employees, and from a funding standpoint is valuated at unicorn status. For those of you who play a little bit in the world of funding and valuations, you know exactly what that means. And you know that for a firm to go from 2013 to now and achieve that status, they're definitely doing something right and something effectively. A wise person once told me that there's no shortage of technology, there's a shortage of technology that works. And today we're going to be looking at how DarkTrace has made AI work in the world of cybersecurity. And my guest, somebody who grew up in the same lands where I grew up in the United Arab Emirates, is one who's going to talk to us not just about the AI components of things, but looking at it from a cloud perspective. Without further ado, welcome to the Power Hour. My name is Ali Hirji, and you know me as the lead at Durham College's AI Hub and Center for Cybersecurity Innovation. I want to thank the team at CyberX, the team at Cyber Exchange, and the team at DarkTrace for sponsoring today's Power Hour. And I'm going to welcome Nabil, who heads up cloud security at DarkTrace, to introduce himself. Nabil, welcome to the Power Hour.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me, Ali. It's a pleasure to be here.
Pleasure's all mine, my friend.
Yeah, I guess in terms of introductions, as you mentioned, my name is Nabil. I'm our director of cloud security. I've been with DarkTrace for quite a number of years now. I was actually one of their first technologists that joined the company when we just opened up our businesses in Canada. And as you mentioned, I think it's really interesting because the opportunity and the growth that we've experienced at DarkTrace is really something unprecedented. It's not something that you see or hear about often, if much. And to experience that kind of tremendous growth, be part of it, and have a piece of really cutting edge technology that does, as you said, it works, and it works really well, has been a true pleasure. So I'm really, really happy to be here with you today.
Nabil, let's take a step back. One of the things that I always tell my teams is when it comes to AI, and I suppose you can probably say this about math in general, one of the best ways to learn it is to actually do it. I want to take the first 5 minutes to really celebrate DarkTrace as an organization. Tell us a little bit about your journey to DarkTrace. What did you study? Where were you previously? And what brought you to this point to start working at DarkTrace? Nabil?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's actually a really important question. I think there's a lot to it. By trade, I actually studied electrical engineering at McGill. And I was always a big fan of technology. I even did a thesis in printed semiconductors where we were actually trying to print electronics onto paper and try to see, what are their material properties? At what point do they overheat? How effective can they be in things like wearables and things like that? And after graduating, I think I did what I would call the traditionally responsible move. I remember I had a number of different kind of career opportunities I was looking at, and kind of discussing with some of my close mentors and colleagues. They said, well, you studied electrical engineering for 4 years. You may as well try your hand at electrical engineering to know what you've studied all these years and what its application looks like. I really quickly came to realize that it wasn't necessarily for me. I think, when I look back at it, and I've spoken to a lot of old colleagues. I've done a little bit of mentorship with, past friends that I had at McGill in terms of university students and how they look at it. I find that a lot of times there are roles that are very highly technical, right? And I think especially when you talk about things as attractive as artificial intelligence, those technical roles will require a high degree of dedication, right? You can't just have an undergrad and say, yeah, I want to be working on this cutting edge AI that's going to solve all of mankind's problems. You have to show a little bit more prowess and dedication than that. On the other side of the coin, you have, highly social fields of work, places where you're not necessarily touching or playing much at all with the technology, but you're involved in the communication of it, maybe the marketing of it, the selling of it. And there are very few roles that allow you a nice marriage or joining of the two.
Correct.
And if I take it a step further, there's actually even fewer roles that allow you to have that without extensive experience. A lot of the types of things that, we see out there in terms of the industry, things like solution architects, things like professional services, it requires a certain level of experience where if you're a student, right, you're just graduating, where are you going to get the experience from if you need it to do the kind of work that you do? And to add to all of that, I think cyber is one of those really niche markets that isn't necessarily the easiest market to break into to begin with. And to that extent, I really lucked out, if I'm being honest, with coming across an organization like DarkTrace, where it was giving me a lot of the things that were important to me as someone that was looking for what drives me and what kind of atmosphere I want, high level of autonomy, a lot of trust. But they were still allowing and happy to guide me, train me, give me the right level of exposure and understanding I needed to be effective at my job. And those types of opportunities are far and few in between, where you have a company that's willing to support you from the ground up, willing to give you impactful work and let you take full ownership to prove what you're capable of doing and the value you're able to generate. And it's just been phenomenal, absolutely phenomenal. Spoken to close to 1,000 customers at my, the last, 4.5, 5 years at DarkTrace. And just the experience we've had with growth. I've personally grown my team multiple times over. And I think it's one of those things where the kind of advice I would have, if you will, for people that are looking at their career planning and they're looking at what do I do and how do I break into something like an AI type field. I always say you should always follow your passions. But once you find something that's giving you what you thirst for, you have to put your full weight and dedication behind it. And I think it's through that dedication that it really opens doors and kind of propels your career to heights that you otherwise would have a really, really hard time achieving.
I want to work with that piece where you talked about cyber being a bit of a difficult space to break into. At the end of the CISO Forum, which DarkTrace was a sponsor of, we had the CISO Forum Awards. And the Lifetime Achievement Award was given to Jamie Reese out in New Brunswick, a well-known CISO in the Canadian community and in the North American community. And he had one piece of advice for budding CISOs, or people who wanted to break into the executive space of cybersecurity, kind of like yourself. And he spoke about the power of showing up, just being there at these venues, being there at these conferences, showing up to that opportunity that you may not know much about. I would argue that 2013, 2015 onwards, this conversation of the marriage between AI and cybersecurity was something that very few technical lawmakers would have even imagined. But now it's become something where it's almost expected that you're using some form of machine learning, some sort of automated learnings and techniques to study the world of cybersecurity and to study the threats, which takes me to my first sort of endeavor to look into and understand the makeup of DarkTrace. When you look back at it from 2013, you've got very strong mathematicians, you've got folks with a background in investigations, you've got folks with a background in cybersecurity that all came together to develop this pattern of life when it comes to understanding what's happening within an organization and the types of traffic that it's seeing and the types of activities that we're seeing. Can you help us understand, without looking at signature patterns and looking constantly for anomalies, what is that secret sauce? What is that pattern of life that DarkTrace seeks to look at within an organization? And how quickly do some of your products pick up the normal state of affairs within a company and what's outside of the normal? Nabil, introduce us to your tech stack.
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of when I started in those early years, right, you're absolutely right in that it was a joining and a marriage of a group of expert mathematicians and previous government officials with the UK. And the kind of backdrop against this kind of whole story is the fact that during the 2012 Olympics, some of our founding members were actually in charge of securing the UK's critical national infrastructure. And what they quickly realized is what really a lot of the security industry at large deals with, which is you're kind of always a few steps behind the bad guy. Alert goes off, an adversary does something, and you're sitting there trying to piece together what exactly they did, what their likely next move is going to be, and you try to prevent against that. And if you actually break it down a little further, just at a very kind of theoretical level, what attackers do and what kind of makes a lot of the security game difficult is the fact that the attackers are always changing, right? They obviously they can recycle old and previously used attacks, but they know that the security industry, once they see it, they'll put the safeguards and controls in place to catch against it. The other thing that also makes it really difficult is we cannot also use what we've seen previously to determine the future state of attacks, right? So when you look at these two aspects, it becomes a really interesting problem to solve for. And if you try to find a solution, the most similar parallel you will find is something like, the human immune system, where when you're born as a human, your body doesn't know every known bad thing in the world. So what does it do to secure you and to kind of safeguard against viruses and infections? It learns your DNA. It understands everything it can about Nabil. It understands everything it can about Ali, and it knows me from you and you from me. And if something enters our body or starts messing with it that doesn't belong, it finds it and it tosses it out. Now, this is a really interesting perspective because it's not just written in theory. There's actually a very large amount of research that's done about specifically how do you use machine learning in such a way that reduces noise, that reduces false positives. And one of the most interesting takeaways is, or the most effective ways to actually solve for this problem is, instead of just trying to learn what to detect, you should also learn what you'll never detect, what's normal, right? By learning what's normal, you're automatically able to understand and foretell what should be happening, and things that have never happened before in the past are able to surface themselves. So this anomaly-based, or this unsupervised, if you will, machine learning-based approach, where you're not defining necessarily what to find, but you're defining what belongs, it's a very, very elegant solution to finding out, how do I defend against something I haven't seen before? How do I defend against really difficult cases, things like insider threat, where they have all the access, they have all the tools, they have all the controls, they know exactly how to move and where to go.
Yep.
And I think that approach has fundamentally really set DarkTrace in a really incredible technology path, where we've been able to show out in the earlier years, right, in those 2013, 2014, 2015 years, that our approach works really well to catching things that go missed all the time. A few of the other key benefits that come along with it is deploys really easily. You don't have to tell it what to look for. You don't have to program it. You don't have to give it all the use cases, because it learns what normal is on its own, and on its own will tell you what doesn't belong, right? And I think, just ultimately speaking, because usually the follow-up question almost always is, how much better is it, right? How much value is there in the tool? And what I always say is that if you can get it really accurate, and if you can get detections that are really high quality, then the true litmus test is the fact that you can then take autonomous response, right? If your detections and if your learning and if your machine learning algorithms are so good that they could properly learn an entire business's environment, from what users are doing on their endpoint, to their email, to SaaS applications, to interacting with corporate network files, then you should be able to autonomously of yourself enforce that normal. And that is the true test of how good your detections really are, right?
Absolutely. And I think I want to work with that idea just a little bit more, because I know we've got attendees from across different enterprises. We've got quite a few folks who come from the public sector as well. Often there's this nervousness when you adopt a particular solution, especially one like DarkTrace that, Nabil, if I can take a step back just a little bit and put my 2 rupees of thought on the table, when you talk about many firms that are now using AI, they've got a core stack upon which they've layered AI. DarkTrace's very core is artificial intelligence. It doesn't exist without AI. There's no tech stack for DarkTrace without artificial intelligence. But there's always this nervousness. And that's where my 2 rupees come in, is that some firms wonder is that when you bring in a technology like DarkTrace, Does it actually negate the need for human intelligence? Does it actually bring down, especially in unionized environments, does it actually impact the number of people that I can employ in my stock? And to that, I always countered. I think you put it so beautifully when he said, look, artificial intelligence does not downplay human intelligence. It merely upends it and asks it to specialize, which is where I want to go into a question which has actually come in from a CIO from the public sector, where he says, talk to us a little bit about the areas of focus on how you can apply DarkTrace technologies. Because if you look at your website, there's very specific focus on email security, then there's the visualization, and then there's the autonomous responses. But you can also buy them as one conclusive package as well. Talk to us about how the tech stack is layered and how you can take a layered approach to applying DarkTrace. Nabil?
Absolutely. I think that's a really interesting question for a few different reasons. But going back to the whole immune system analogy for a second, the human immune system, if you actually look into the biology behind it, it's an incredibly fascinating work of art. And there's a lot of complexities and different aspects and different types of cells and structures and things like that you could look into. But ultimately, it acts as a whole, right? And I think from that perspective, I think a lot to be gained from looking at the security challenge. And there are a lot of tools and technologies out there that do a really great job at looking at a siloed slice of a business and saying, this is exactly what we're going to address. But when you're looking at a lot of the challenges we have today, and this is something that, to be honest with you, it grew naturally. The best solution and the best way forward oftentimes is going to involve taking a very coherent approach to making sure that your technology is providing maximum value. And to explain this a little bit more, I'll give you an example. When DarkTrace first started, all we used to do was that we would purely just do detection. So we would find unusual behaviors in businesses and we'd say, oh, that doesn't look right. Someone should take a look at that. Oh, this user is doing something that really smells like insider threat. Someone needs to take a look at that. And you know what the number one feedback we got from customers was? It was, you're giving me all this information. I can't action it fast enough.
Yeah.
Right. So from that perspective, we're like, all right, well, let's layer in autonomous response where we're not only detecting things, but we're also responding to them in real time and buying back time for the security team. And that was all fine and well. And eventually the next piece of feedback we got was, well, all this autonomous response is fantastic. 80% of what you're stopping against is coming in from email. Right. So it only made sense to kind of use this approach and kind of grow it out and grow it out and grow it out to the point where we could take this anomaly-based approach to learning normal for anything in the business, anywhere it is in the business. And what happened as a result of that is customers are free to kind of leverage or use any aspect of our platform that they wish. But our goal, and from a development perspective, we always want them to have a platform effect, that they gain additional value if they look at expanding the problem set, or if they run into new challenges that previously they didn't have good solutions in place for.
Excellent. And Nabil, I think you'll forgive me if I start to do a little bit of a surgical inquiry into this, because I do sit at the intersection of both AI and security. And while I refrain from saying that I'm buying into what you're saying, I will say that as an academic, I definitely see the parallels between our thoughts in terms of what you're saying about a concentrated approach and application of AI. I think one of the things that I drew from what you just said is that, listen, if you don't measure something, then all the lines look straight to you, right? You don't have any measurement, you don't have any yardstick. And you've made very clear that not every solution requires an AI solution, but there are certain firms that are at a certain health point or at a certain performance level where AI does make sense. I know that there's a question that's come in about who's the ideal candidate to use a DarkTrace-like solution, but I'm going to take that question second. And again, a shout out to the Cyber Exchange team for making this so simple for me. And I'm going to take one that came in just now, which relates to a quote that I heard at CISO Forum Canada, where the gentleman from IBM said, listen, there is no AI without IA. There's no artificial intelligence without information architecture. If I'm a firm that's looking to deploy an AI solution, both the automated response, automated detection, all of that, the whole gamut of DarkTrace tools, how important is it to know for DarkTrace how our databases are set up, how some of our information process systems are in place? Do you do any initial scanning of a company before validating that you can well and truly apply your AI solution? Or do you have that level of confidence that you'll achieve an accuracy level regardless of the scenario?
Yeah, so I think that I just want to take a step back from that just for a second as well, because I think there are a number of really important points you brought up there. And just from a security perspective, and this is just purely looking at it in terms of understanding what the security industry looks like and what I personally think the focus or the approach should be at a DarkTrace. And this is something I see all the time, right? There is no replacement for best practices in cybersecurity.
Yeah.
And this is something I want to make exquisitely clear, because it's something that becomes a very interesting topic for discussion and consultation, which is, oh, look at this new shiny micro segmentation AI machine learning tool that, does hyperconvergence and all this other stuff, but you don't have the basics right, you're gonna have a big problem.
Absolutely.
And to that extent, I think, you look at businesses that don't have the right approach, at least the fundamentals in place, whether it's the culture and the people, process, technology part, or whether it's understanding that first I need to layer in strong firewall, endpoint protection, all this other stuff. What I always say is that, to me, DarkTrace's real value add is in the fact that it can go beyond what is currently in a security stack with the heavy leveraging of machine learning. But if you don't have a mature security stack to begin with, the starting point really isn't there. And I think in terms of kind of information architecture as well, there's a few really interesting pieces around that that I just wanted to address really quickly, because while we sit here today, you and I talking about AI as if it's a very well understood, very well practiced, science, I distinctly remember the first Black Hat I went to, and in big letters, we had AI approach on our banner. And every single person that would come up to our booth would say, what is this? What does this even mean? Right? What, as you asked, right? Which part of my security stack does this fit into? And not that there's anything wrong with that kind of questioning, but you also have to understand that there are aspects of this that have become so commercialized, right? Where any company will do the slightest bit of regression analysis, slap an AI sticker on top of it, and try to see if they can generate some massive returns on the investment. So I think from that perspective, it's really important, and something I encourage all the listeners to do, is ask questions, be inquisitive, because being inquisitive and being able to ask and dig into it will really show you to what extent that company is truly leveraging different types of machine learning, whether it's one type of machine learning, whether it's machine learning in a single module that's shoved into the least interesting feature, or if it's spread across, across the entire platform.
Yeah.
And I think to that extent, there is a lot that I would recommend people to do and to ask for. And I think this is a two-way street, right? It requires some work, it requires some investigation, it requires people to go out and really seek out the truth for themselves to see what is it exactly that I'm trying to see here and do.
Absolutely. And to the audience, one of the things that I'm going to mention here, and I don't say this very often. I mean, whenever I have conversations with the vendor community, I'm very clear on saying that I don't like to use the word vendor. I like to use the word partner, especially when they can be open and transparent. One of the things that you're learning from Nabil right now is, and this is a DarkTrace positioning that he's taking, is that, look, there is a bit of a black box. There is a little bit of a gray area when it comes to AI. But when you talk in security, these unknown unknowns, you have to be ready to embrace them. And I really appreciate the fact, Nabil, that you're not saying that this is all surgically precise. There are a lot of unknowns that we have to factor in. But the way in which the model studies those unknowns, how quickly it's able to respond, how proactively it's able to detect those unknowns, is where the power of AI comes in. So thank you, Nabil, for bringing that up. I want to go back to something that you mentioned around, and this is very, very prevalent amongst all of the DarkTrace literature that's out there. And I want to thank Kathy and the team of DarkTrace for sending me quite a lot of information. For those of you who are watching the show right now, you'll notice that there's a little ticker beneath there that also has some information on blogs and white papers and case studies that you can read from DarkTrace. There's a lot of talk about the perimeter being dead. And this is not a new concept. People know this. People talk about the perimeter being dead hopefully they know it, talk about the perimeter being dead and talk about access and identity access management as the core perimeter now. I want to ask you is that instead of focusing on the perimeter, we need to focus on deployment. Where do you see as the priority areas where DarkTrace solutions need to be deployed? We talked about email security as well, but what about other endpoint securities as well? What about especially the notion right now when we're working remotely? Tell us a little bit about where DarkTrace is best deployed.
Absolutely. I think, to me, there's an aspect of looking at it and saying, where we're best deployed is where customers have the most risk. I think that's obviously a bit of a cop-out answer, but I find that, I'm not one to come and tell an organization where you should be worried if they know exactly what their priorities look like and kind of how they're going to approach securing their stack. But I find, especially since the beginning of the pandemic, the workforce has become so dynamic. And the challenges that I find are not just logistical or administrative, but they're also adversarial as well. And what I mean by that is, and I say this all the time, whatever technologies that we leverage as end users and whatever benefits those give us, those benefits apply equally well to attackers. And if you look at it from that perspective, and you go from having an office space where everything is secured from your main IT closet to all of a sudden having no one in the office, right? There's a certain load and burden that falls on the IT and security team's shoulders to readjust everything for that. But equally well, the attackers know in that point in time what you're going through. They know that you used to be in that office and there was an IT closet with all your security gear in there, and you're no longer using that office the way you used to. And to that end, I find that one of the really big shocking factors I've seen from at least a DarkTrace perspective, one was the sheer volume of attackers that have just been feasting off of people and their constant change. The other aspect I also want to talk that was really impressive to me was how well AI modules adapted to learning new normals and new patterns once people went and started working from home. I really find it incredible. And there's so much research out there, but I mean, we saw things like hundreds of thousands of new domains being associated to the pandemic that were purely registered for malicious purposes, right? These volumes are incredible. They're insane. And you have to also understand from an end user perspective, all of a sudden you're working in the comforts of your own home with a company machine that no one's looking at you. No one's looking over your shoulder. 5:30 rolls around. Maybe you want to do some online shopping. There's no one sitting there saying, no, you should go use your personal machine for that. That's not a work related activity. So you add and factor in all these different aspects. And I think it brews up this perfect storm. And what we've seen is, DarkTrace has done really, really well in terms of not just securing customers that have gone remote, but also being able to adapt by learning new patterns and behaviors. And obviously, we've changed a lot of our roadmap since the beginning of the pandemic because different technologies have become more prevalent. We recently announced client sensors where we're able to fully deploy our platform to endpoints without the need of a network or servers or port mirrors or anything like that. And that required a lot of work and a lot of kind of reshifting of resources. But at the end of the day, that's what our customer base required. That has become the new means of what people need in this day and age.
So let's work with that just a little bit more. And a question that's come in, which I'll take right now, and I totally expected this to come in when we are talking about this AI application within cybersecurity and understanding if I go back to the original comment that I made, that pattern of life within an organization and now with people being remote, is a question around privacy. And we all know very well is that privacy is not the aspect of, hey, I have nothing to hide. It's really about protecting the information that you have out there and setting some and knowing what is being tracked of my behavior. How does DarkTrace deal with some of those privacy matters? For example, if you have an endpoint that's doing biometrics for access into a particular facility, but you're tracking, how many people are coming in, how many people are exiting that facility, etc. And that forms part of that DNA of understanding the security complexities within an organization. How do you make sure that those data points that you're getting, are they personally identifiable? What do you do in order to make sure that you have protected the privacy of those individuals whose data, not necessarily you're gathering, but whose data you're kind of studying and coding into a pattern of life like algorithm?
I think one important point you touched on there is ultimately the aspect of privacy that I think is really important for customers to keep in mind is what data are vendors taking, or your partners for that matter. And this is an approach that we've had at DarkTrace since day one, where we don't harvest any of the data of any of our customers. We don't actually take any of it back to ourselves. And they get to keep all the data that we're monitoring for them, and we deploy our solutions within their own environments. So from our perspective, I call it the Apple approach, not the Google approach, But it's one of those things where I think it's absolutely critical, because at the end of the day, if you really have something that can learn from the ground up every time it's deployed, you don't need to take that data. I find that the tricky discussions you fall into about privacy and where is your data going to be analyzed, the majority of those discussions arise when a company is using technology that is very heavily reliant on training data sets.
Yeah.
That needs to harvest data and to kind of continuously train itself to then be able to function properly. And that type of supervised machine learning approach really doesn't do much in the face of helping against some of those fundamental challenges of finding things that you haven't seen before.
Yep.
You haven't seen it before, there's no data set for it, right? So I think it's a really good point you bring up, and to me, it really nicely highlights the fact that you always have to consider what exactly is a piece of technology doing for me and how is it doing, right? That aspect of deployment, I think is just so crucial. I find you could have the best technology in the world. If it's an absolute pain to get deployed, you best believe that it's going to be a big deterrent for a lot of people. So I could not agree more with you on that.
Yeah, and I said that, that's why I said it at the introduction, right? Is that the problem is that it's not like we have a shortage of technology. We've got a shortage of technology that actually works. And I do want to sort of go into battle just a little bit around the AI claims and so on and so forth, because as you know very well, there are numerous partner organizations out there that are provisioning some form of AI at certain gateways or have certain protocols at which they are provisioning AI. And I do want to inquire that just a little bit. Well, we'll come to that at the end, because I do have another question that's come in. And this is the aspect on something that you said earlier on, which is the emphasis on data. Now, I sound like a broken record every time I say this, but my audience knows I put it on a shirt. I've always said that if AI is the rocket, data is the fuel, and there's no going anywhere without fuel. Which takes me to my point to you, Nabil, is for someone like myself responsible for deploying certain solutions, making budgetary decisions on what solutions we're going to deploy, one of my points of inquiry with DarkTrace would be, well, tell me a little bit, and that's the question that's coming. Tell me about your own research and development practice. How are you gathering your threat intelligence? How are you gathering your data sets? Where are you gathering your data sets from? Do you have a dedicated research and development practice that is ensuring that besides looking in a production environment or the pattern of life within production, besides doing that, what does your dev environment look like, and how are you constantly ensuring that your algorithms, whether deployed at the cloud, which is your specialty, or at other endpoints, how do you ensure that they're, for lack of a better word, kick-ass?
I think there's an aspect to this where something we do a lot of, and we have a pretty extensive R&D program, and we have a pretty large number of academics that specifically look at the machine learning and artificial intelligence aspect of it. There are things that you could look at from a perspective of, how do I make the detections more accurate, or how do I improve or modify them, and what kind of lab setup that you do. And I think there's a number of different approaches to that, right? There's different ways you can instantiate or mimic an organization, or a lot of what we do at DarkTrace with a lot of our kind of cutting edge developments is that we test them internally. And I know we've, for example, one really interesting development that we came across, and it's in terms of the limitations of what currently exist. And to give you an example of this, for the longest time, when you look at a security stack, something like email security will typically be disjoint from anything else there is, whether it's endpoint security or network security or anything else you might have in place. What we found at DarkTrace is, because the majority of what we see in terms of attacks that proliferate through the network or through the business originate, the initial vector comes through email, that doesn't make sense, right? What you need to have is an email solution that is network or business aware as a whole, right? Okay. And to develop something like that is no simple task, because you're essentially trying to gather context and share context in real time, where the context for a whole business isn't necessarily transferable in real time, right? This is a lot of context and a lot of data you're trying to, share and communicate and to ask and to, question and challenge. But when you're able to get that done right, all of a sudden that barrier to context when it comes to email security disappears.
Yeah.
And it opens the floodgates for being able to do things where the approach itself, not necessarily the quality or the accuracy, but the approach itself is entirely novel, right? For example, if you look at a mature security program, integrations are a big part, right? No one says, I want a tool that doesn't integrate, right? Everyone wants tools that can hook into each other and they can create playbooks and they can kind of create different scenarios of if this action happens in tool A, then this is how it proliferates, throughout the rest of my security stack. But what becomes really interesting is what if you're able to have it all be fluid and to actually be retrospective and contextualized, right? All of a sudden you get rid of that kind of approach and you introduce a novel approach that allows you to in real time do things that no human can think up of in advance. And I know we could put aside probably some time later in our discussion to talk about case studies.
Yep.
One of the things that I've been very, very inspired by in my time at DarkTrace is that, a lot of the things that we're talking about here, they sound great, in theory, but seeing these things play out in real life and actually seeing, your detection engine be able to respond in real time and not just respond to things that are known, but to take actions that we don't really put much thought to. And what I mean by that is if something goes terribly wrong and you don't know what the next bad thing is that's going to happen, wouldn't it be great to just say, hey, how about you just enforce what I normally do?
Yep.
Business as usual. Just give me business as usual and kill everything else, right? The only way you could do that is if you know what business as usual looks like. Right. So again, in terms of research and development, I think, there's obviously an aspect of, refining the craft and improving what already exists. But I think the more interesting part to me and what I find is absolutely incredible at DarkTrace is being able to take, what I call tectonic leaps in terms of what we're capable of. And it's not just that. One thing I also wanted to bring up is in terms of the progression, because I know I've talked a little bit about this, about how at first it was detection and then it was detection and respond. And then it was not just the network, but also email and correlating the two. But what's one piece of feedback that I used to get for years, and it was ubiquitous, regardless the size of organization, the type of company or industry I'm talking to, every single time I would meet with customers, this would be something that would come up in one way or another. They would always say, Nabil, at the end of the day, I need a human to look at this.
Yep.
Right? We're talking about AI. They would say, I need a human to look at this. So one thing that we set about to do was how do you really augment the human? Not in just not in a rhetorical sense, but in a real practical sense. And what we found is the only way you can augment humans is if you understand what a human would have done.
Absolutely.
Right. And to that extent, what we've done is over the last 4 years, we've monitored our internal SOC team at DarkTrace. And with their permission, we've understood how they use the DarkTrace platform to see when they get a certain type of activity that gets bubbled up, what do they do? How do they investigate? Where do they go? And we've essentially created this massive data lake where we could then use it to learn and get those insights that you were talking about at the beginning. Yeah. And now we can essentially provide what we call a cyber AI analyst. It's the equivalent of a full-time employee that essentially sits there. It's pure software. It doesn't feel stress. It doesn't feel concern. And it will go through and not just understand what has been done, but it will correlate. It will stitch together disparate events. And we've seen it reduce time to triage by up to 92%. Right? And these are the types of lists when you talk about, research and development, I get excited to talk about because this is the type of stuff we need more of, right? Yeah, this type of tectonic leap where all of a sudden you're saving all this time on level 1 SOC triage that is toil. It's absolute torture. And it's no fun for anyone. Yep. If I can offload that to a piece of AI, all of a sudden you've liberated, the human faculties to do higher order activities that otherwise they wouldn't be able to do.
Absolutely. And I want to work with that metaphor that you used on tectonic leaps. Now, this may have a little bit to do with your time in the UAE and the desert safaris that you would have enjoyed growing up. But in that word of tectonic leap, I've said this a lot to my teams when we're training different models. And I've said, listen, you need mountains, not fancy staircases to train hikers. And when someone comes to me and tells me, our algorithm can do this, and they simulate it for me and they put in their own malware and show me how it's not been deceived and they've predicted the malware at the syslog level, I applaud, but then I go, thank you very much. Give me a demo environment for a week, and I'm going to institute my own types of malware. And I'm not going to put it at the file level. I'm going to put it in another environment, maybe in a different area, maybe inject it to the operating systems, but not use the typical file topologies for those injections. Do you allow your potential customers to quote unquote enjoy the DarkTrace experience and test it out within a sandbox-like environment?
We do, and I'll actually take it a step further because I think in a sandbox is a very biased way to look at things. Because what works in your sandbox, I could almost guarantee might not necessarily work out in real life.
Mm-hmm.
And to that end, what we actually do, and this was, interestingly enough, this was our go-to-market strategy when I started DarkTrace. I remember training, I sat down and they said, Nabil, this is the go-to-market strategy. Any customer that's interested in anything that we have to offer, we'll provide it to them free of charge, fully deployed for a month. You get a month, we'll give you our tech. You could take it through its paces, right? You could run a red team pen test. You could try to run a phishing exercise, do whatever you want. And not only will we provide the tech, but we'll actually also set you up with weekly meetings where we go over the findings, give you training, show you how the tool works and what it's doing in the background. And back then when I started DarkTrace, it was really necessary because we were a bit of a market disruptor, right? We were the company kind of coming out saying we don't fit into any category. Back then when I started, Gartner didn't even have a category for us.
Right.
And the only way we could kind of prove our worth was to say, hey, listen, we'll show you. We will literally show you this and you could do whatever you want with it, right? And here I am, all these years later, and we're still doing it because it lands differently. When people can experience it for themselves, it has a different effect. And I find that when it comes to technology that works, there's no replacement for deploying technology and showing them firsthand this stuff works, and it works in real life scenarios, not just in some made up sandbox scenario that we've agreed upon, right?
And this is where the case studies really come in. And I know that the team, we've got about 15 odd minutes left. To the team at CyberX, I will say this is a very, very fascinating topic. And I would, if we're all open to it, and I know the folks at DarkTrace are listening to this as well, I would like to have a second session where we actually unpack some of those case studies in more detail. And Nabil, I would definitely invite you to return for that case study analysis along with other folks from DarkTrace, because there's an academic pulse to this, but there's also a very strong operational pulse that we need to dissect. I could go on this topic, but I do want to now bring in another question that's come in. And this is on the aspect, and I expected this to come in, is for those individuals who are heavily well-versed in the world of AI, you have mentioned quite eloquently the importance of human validation. You still need, even in our automated threat responses and automated detection responses, there is still a level of control, and there is still a level of, for quote unquote, a kill switch for the automation, where human validation still takes place. Can you talk to us a little bit about how the model, the AI model, which is the unsupervised model that DarkTrace deploys, how has it been trained on the aspect of false positives? Is that's where you're seeing more of human intelligence being involved, or do you have a different approach to detecting false positives and not necessarily eliminating them, but responding to them accurately within your model? Nabil?
Yeah, absolutely. The topic of false positives is actually a really fascinating one.
Yeah.
And if I wanted to be, very, very academic about this, by definition, a false positive would be something that you claim is one thing, but actually isn't. And if you look at the way DarkTrace learns, right, and then the way we generate these patterns of life, when we find behaviors that don't belong, the way we actually flag them is that based on the different metrics that they're behaving anomalously, we'll say this looks like an unusual activity X, right? An unusual login, an unusual data download or data dump. And from that perspective, this whole idea of false positive doesn't really translate per se.
Yeah.
And the reason I say that is it's not saying it's malicious, it's saying it's weird. And it's saying it's weird because it hasn't done it before, right? But to the extent of eliminating things that might be minor or not necessarily important enough to the end user, I think our cyber AI analyst, that piece of technology I talked about that augments the human, it plays two pivotal tricks. One is if I have, and I'll just entertain you, Ali, here for a second. Let's say,
You've been entertaining me since the start, buddy.
let's say you wanted to just run a red team exercise to kind of see how the security stack is looking, right?
Yeah.
You invite your pen testers over. They do a bunch of activities and exercises. They scan the network. They try to move laterally. They try to connect to some domains you've all agreed upon that they're going to try to connect to. If you look at your security tools, how many alerts are you going to get on the back of your red team?
Interesting.
Dozens minimum, right? Minimum, you're going to, for every thing, right, that doesn't make sense or doesn't belong or is against the rules, you're going to get an alert.
Yeah.
And what happens that becomes really interesting is that when we run DarkTrace as Cyber AI Analyst, we actually see multiple alerts, whether it's 6, 10, 12, shrink to a single incident that's been pre-triaged. And that incident inside of it contains all the flags, right? It contains that happened, and that was there's your network scan, and there's your lateral movement, and there's your command and control, and there's the mission account, and it's all there. But instead of looking at 12 different alerts, you're looking at one fully analyzed incident. Now, on the flip side of that, the number of alerts that you get that go nowhere, right? Routine backup that happens once a year. First time the technology is seeing it, it looks weird, right? We've never seen it before. It stands out in terms of an anomaly. It gets flagged as an alert, but nothing happens off the back of that. And when you look at everything through the lens of our cyber AI analyst, nothing shows up. It literally takes all the alerts that you've seen before, and instead of putting you in this mode of operation that's alert based, puts you in a mode of operation that's incident based. And the noise just falls off a cliff, right? Because you're purely looking at incidences. And one other really neat thing that happens when you could do good correlation is not just the fact that the number of events that you look at decreases dramatically, but they also get prioritized favorably as well. Yeah. And what I mean by that is, in terms of a case study, I remember this like it was yesterday. There was one example we had with a very advanced attacker. There were a hacker group called Fancy Bear, based in Russia. They've been known to do quite some interesting things in the past. They were actually inside a customer's network when we were running a trial for them, and they were exfiltrating 10 megs a day of data. 10 megs a day is nothing. And I don't think most people would bat an eyelash at that kind of data download. And what happens is, naturally speaking, you won't prioritize that type of event anyways. So even if you had a tool that was prioritizing it at the top of the list, you would deprioritize it. You say, put this at the bottom, at the back. I don't need to see this often. But when it happens 3, 4, 5 days in a row, all of a sudden it becomes interesting. And through the power of correlation, you could take 3 very low scoring activities that you would never look at, and you can reprioritize it as something that's really, really important and interesting and should be analyzed, right? So I think, the power of correlation and being able to look at not just the events that you're detecting that don't belong, but how they interplay with each other. I think it really does a lot in terms of prioritization, as well as, giving you actionable intelligence as opposed to activities that you as an end user have to make sense out of.
Going back to my point right at the start, I think I said, put that on a shirt, right? Which is the role of computing is not about numbers, it's about insight. And, to our audience, you rarely see me talk in this vein, but, when you think about technology, Nabil mentioned a point that I subscribe to all the time: people, process, technology, and in that order. Mark Dillon, Vice President of Waterloo Hydro, talks about this all the time. A whole bunch of other folks around the CyberX, Cyber Exchange Advisory talk about this piece. Technology works well when it brings people together. One of the things, I know I haven't been entirely open about this, is having been exposed to the DarkTrace tech stack myself, and having had the pleasure of deploying it as well, I know fully well that there's a feedback loop that you're allowed to even engage with the DarkTrace team. So sometimes what you're seeing and what you've qualified and classified differently in your own practices, you can share that. And I cannot tell you how important it is to build community around your tech stack, open community. I've said this many, many times. Technology works best when it brings people together. We've got another 8 minutes left, Nabil, and there's so much more. And I promise you, if timing allows us, I do want to do another session on case studies, because this is truly fascinating. And you straddle both academia and business really, really well. So thank you for your insights. And quite a few questions have come in directly on instant messaging. So thank you all for your questions. I'll try to get to as many of them as I can. One question here that stands out for me, and that is the aspect of who is the ideal candidate for a DarkTrace solution. Now, of course, the salesman pitch would say everybody, but there's an aspect of cost. How are the solutions cost, especially because on Cyber Exchange, there are a lot of small to medium businesses on here that are scaling in different regions across Canada. From a costing perspective, is this favorable to SMBs, and how can one, even if their architecture does not span millions of users or hundreds of thousands of users, is this technology accessible to them and cost effective?
You know, to answer that question, I'll let you know that our smallest customer in Canada
Yeah.
is under 20 employees, and our largest customer is tens of thousands of employees. So that gives you a bit of an idea in the fact that in terms of our commercial approach, we're not cost prohibitive in the sense of a lot of, you know, I find that when you talk about cutting edge AI that can actually deliver value, it's usually the first fear that strikes into the hearts of the small and medium sized businesses is that, ooh, that's gonna cost, not just in terms of the technology, but in terms of the manpower. And it's something that I know at DarkTrace we've been really focusing on, is to try to solve both ends of that problem, right? And if you look at it, one thing that we're really obsessed with and what we invest an insane amount of time and resource into is the development and the furthering of our own technology, right? I think in the few short years since 2013 till now, it's not just about the number of customers or the number of employees we've grown into, but to me, it's each one of these technology leaps that we make moving forward is, in my way, such an incredible return on investment for our customers that have been loyal with us for all these years. And I think it's really paid off for a lot of the small and medium-sized businesses that have embraced this approach. They're still reaping the benefits of it now, right? So I think we're only going to continue to further what we can do from a machine learning and AI perspective. But you know, to me, at the end of the day, if the technology is not accessible, then you know you're cannibalizing your own purpose. So to that end, there is nothing, and there really should be nothing that's cost prohibitive to DarkTrace. And you know, I always share my details with you know, people in conferences and talks. They're always more than welcome to reach out to me if they had any questions. But we are not favoring any specific size. In terms of nature of customer that DarkTrace is great for, I always say this. I say if you've done the basics of security right, and I mean the real basics, right? You've properly implemented firewalls, you've segmented your network, you have good endpoint protection, and you're looking for the next thing. I find that DarkTrace does a lot in terms of adding fresh value and going a step above what the basics usually offer you. And it does it in a really elegant way that's easy to deploy. It's, you know, super hands off, doesn't require an insane amount of time or resources from anyone, both DarkTrace and our customers. And that's one of the reasons we still offer these proof of values, is to show them what value they can get in a short 30-day period.
Absolutely. You know, I've always said this, right? The secrets to success is that there are no secrets, and you've got to have that open door policy. One of the things that I do encourage our audience to go on to read some of the blogs that are there, the timeline it takes once a DarkTrace solution is deployed, whether it's the emails or the whole package, depending on where it's deployed within a network, the timeline that it takes for it to start learning the patterns of life and starting to make detections. Very, very short time period within which it's already gone accustomed to the host environment. And I think that's a very fascinating case study that I do want to unpack. We've got 4 more minutes. And Nabil, I do want to ask you one question and then we'll wrap up. And I'm sure we can make sure that we have another session. And Nabil, this is the question that you mentioned a lot about people power, okay? So, you know, once you deploy a solution from a SOC perspective, we've been in quite a few of them, you now have to also realize that your team has to now be proficient with these new models of visualization. Now, at the college, for example, we teach, you know, Elasticsearch, we teach Kibana dashboards, we teach them different models in which they can visualize and they can gather logs, so on and so forth. From your perspective, does the DarkTrace technology now require a new skill set from your traditional SOC analysts and your threat analysts? Do they now need to be proficient in the lingo of AI? And I would argue, yes, to some extent, they need to get comfortable with being uncomfortable with these new technologies. But does DarkTrace provide any trainings to them to get them up to speed? We'll close with this question. Nabil?
Training is absolutely critical, right? If you don't properly enable end users, then, you know, I think that's a great disadvantage to yourself. And at DarkTrace, we take this whole training from a few different angles.
Yeah.
We have an entire, fully functioning customer portal where we have training videos, different series, whether you're a decision maker or management level, user that's trying to understand how to position it, how to communicate it, how to explain risk, and how to explain return on investment to the board. We have specific training tiers or training streams for analysts and end users. We also have a world-class live training team twice a week. They do live training sessions in a variety of different languages. One thing we've done recently, we actually did this in November, and it was a first for us. We held our very first innovation series where we have opened up all of the technology we have to all of our customers. So going back to your question of, who is DarkTrace for? We do not treat anyone any differently. The small guy and the big guy alike, they see exactly all the different types of tools and technologies we can provide. And what was really interesting is that not only did we open that all up for people to look at the entire stack of what we could provide and choose if they wanted to trial any aspect of it, but we actually also had a half-a-day seminar where throughout the seminar, we actually talked about some of the upcoming really interesting projects we're working at internally at DarkTrace. And we even opened it up for our customers to give us feedback and to vote on what type of advancement
feedback loop that I was mentioning.
So to me, I think it's absolutely crucial. But to your point of AI tools, and this is something we've seen, and I've seen this with a few other educational institutions that are DarkTrace customers in North America, we've actually seen the opposite of what you're describing. We have customers that they've actually onboarded a student as an intern, put them through our training program, and after 6 hours, they're the ones that are helping them with their DarkTrace deployment. And to me, that's just testimony of how great and how easy and user-friendly the tool is to use.
Absolutely. And I'm going to close with a comment where, one of the things that you'll know very quickly is that when you do, and again, perhaps when we do our case studies, then I can talk more about the deployment experiences that I've had. But one of the things that you'll notice is that now it's not just security folks who are deploying. So there's somebody who's deploying it, fine, but who's reading the data, who's analyzing the data. One interesting case study that I have is around a student with SEO experience, and the way that student was able to analyze some of the data sets and find patterns. So it's very, very interesting. And I say this all the time, that today's discussion is true testimony to the interdisciplinarity of AI, but also shows you, for example, when CyberX and Durham College and the town of Ajax and the city of Oshawa, we ran the Global Cyber Olympics in 2019. We also ran collegiate penetration testing competition in 2020 with IBM and Rochester Institute of Technology. Some of the teams would have, makeup would be 5 individuals, 1 pen tester, 1 ethical hacker, and then 1 student in philosophy whose focus was on logos. Another person was a linguist. Very, very interesting makeups of the teams. And I would have loved to dive deeper into that. But Nabil, we do have to come to the conclusion of it. I'm going to ask you to hold for a couple of minutes so that we can have some conversations in the green room. But to our audience, what I will say is I hope that you enjoyed this session as a dive into what the DarkTrace stack is all about and the philosophy behind it. I say this a lot of times that you invest in people, not in businesses. You buy relationships, you build relationships with people. The people build the products, the people run the operations. This was a good session where you got to see the people behind the whole ethos around DarkTrace. One of the things that I often say is that sometimes it takes the darkness to show you the light. Sometimes you need to walk through the dark in order to see where you're headed and to see where your blind spots are. I want to thank the team at DarkTrace for walking us through the dark side and helping us trace our routes to safer and more secure practices online. Next week, we're going to be running a couple of sessions with our advisory group, including talking to you about new environments where we're actually going to be simulating training exercises through digital games, one of them being Breach the Keep. With that, I want to thank Nabil for his time and thank the audience for joining us today. Nabil, thank you so very much to you, to Kathy, for making today happen. I'm going to ask you to stay on so we can chat in the green room. Take care, Nabil, and take care to our audience. Stay safe, stay healthy, and I'll see you next week. Nabil, thank you for your time.
Appreciate it. Thank you very much.